No, in fact, he was unnamed. But part of what was wrong with it is you can't write autobiographically about sex. It just can't be done without being, disgusting or embarrassing. And what is repulsive in a first person or a localized third person account of sex is any sense of entitlement. So I had to denude him of any sense of entitlement. I made him an illegitimate orphan so that he had no kind of expectation. And I made him less successful with girls. He's really had quite a lot of trouble getting girlfriends, and I had.
Whereas you did not.
Oh, I did for a while, just enough to know that it's a dreadful slippery slope. That if it starts to go wrong with girls, it can go much worse, get much worse very quickly, because you begin to resent women, and you begin to feel repulsive, and that gets around, and girls can spot it across a room. This feeling of sullen unattractiveness, and then the resentment increases and the unattractiveness increases, and so I can imagine that. I had enough experience of that, thanks. But he's a character constructed for this novel, and in fact not a very assertive character.
Violet Nearing, Keith's sister, although she's a largely off-page character, she is the moral heart of this novel, because she is presented as a victim of the sexual revolution in the 70s.
Yes, I mean Violet, and indeed my sister, would have struggled in any society. But the sexual revolution, all it did was provide the backdrop, the style and setting of that dissolution. And her terrible life was based on promiscuity, assisted by alcohol. The Medicaid wasn't called the Medicaid until 1976. In the summer of 1970, they were only 6 months into it, but they could all be pretty sure that the 1970s was going to be a Medicaid. This was because all decades were now Medicaids. There's never been anything that could possibly be called a Eudecade. Technically speaking, Eudecades, back in the feudal night, would have been known as thou-decades. The 1940s was probably the last we-decade, and all decades until 1970 were undeniably he-decades. So the Medicaid was the me-decade, right enough, a new intensity of self-absorption. But the Medicaid was also, and unquestionably, the she-decade. What it mainly was a huge increase in possibilities, in opportunities. And of course, everyone was feeling their way. And it was the girls who had to make all the difficult choices. The girls had to change. The boys didn't have to change. They just went on being boys and had plenty of practice at that, and they were good at it. But girls were suddenly looking for a model, and I think it's called the equalitarian phase of feminism was the early bit when the orthodoxy was that men and women were the same. The clever ones sort of felt their way and found they did a bit too much of that than they really felt happy with, or they avoided it and say, no, this isn't for me. But they preserved their individuality and their identity and did not get swept up ideologically, which is what all the victims did, where they participated when their heart wasn't in it, when it wasn't really in them to do it. And you should never go against what you really are. You cannot change the sort of clay of what you are. And my sister was just a very spectacular example of how wrong it can go.
And that identification which you've made between Violet in the book and Sally, your late sister, Keith realizes at the time in the 70s how badly wrong it's going for her, but was it for you retrospective that you realized how bad things were?
No, it was very evident, and I used to talk about it with my brother in horror. And I did do what he did. I tried to withdraw emotionally from it because I knew I wouldn't be able to bear to look at it, and a completely futile attempt to muffle the love I felt for her. And I did indeed have what he had when she died. I had my handwriting collapsed for a few months, and I had a year-long sore throat. And then I felt I got over it. And then 3 years later, I had a sort of a physical collapse, after she died, and eventually come to see that that it was the strength and also the violence of very early feelings. My brother and I used to get ourselves into quite an emotional state, saying, oh, if anyone touches her, if anyone lays a finger on her. And then for all our adult lives, we had to sort of stand back and watch as everyone touched her, as everyone abused her. And you can't escape the force of those early feelings. And then it all sort of caught up with me after she died. And I had exactly what he had. I just, getting out of bed in the morning was like a Russian novel. It just took up the rest of the day. It was just, everything was a tremendous effort, just weakness and frailty, and swearing and weeping and all the rest. And you saw the horror of it, of what had happened to her.
And it's a commonplace, in fact, of therapy now that writing about it is supposed to help. I mean, you're a professional writer, so it's different slightly, but was it more or less painful to have to write about it in The Pregnant Widow?
It was perhaps made possible by the fact that there were only two occasions in her life where my sister looked like an adult, a fully conscious adult. And not like a sort of 12-year-old or a 13-year-old. One was when Kingsley died in the hospital. She looked absolutely clear-eyed, and she could see her own future ahead of her. A very impressive look she had on her face. And another time, after I'd helped her out of some entanglement, disaster, and was sort of patching her up afterwards. This was quite late on. And she said, she obviously wanted to give me something. You could feel that she wanted to repay me in some way. And she said with that very clear look, she said, write about me. You can say anything you like, she said. You can tell, all the bad things. And I never forgot that. And I think I might have felt quite uneasy if she hadn't said that.
The Information 1995 is seen as a pivotal book in a less happy way, that when we look back it sort of stands out because you changed publisher, changed agent. It was when the real public kicking began over some of that. Do you look back on it with pangs now?
I look back on the whole period with pangs. It was an awful time for me because I'd left home. But I'm fond of the novel. You perhaps are fondest of the novels that either you struggle with or when they went out in the world, they struggled. And I had such difficulty with that I'm amazed it's there, really. And it was 5 years work. But the surrounding stuff is all, it's all completely extra-literary.
And you tried to avoid cliche in your writing, as we've said, but the cliche that was widely invoked at that time was midlife crisis. Many people said it specifically, new wife, new agent, new publisher, new teeth, all of that. Did any of that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, I had a midlife crisis, but I think it's something of a crisis if you don't have a midlife crisis.